Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, step into the world of Carmine Persico, the feared and cunning boss of the Colombo Crime Family, who ruled for decades from behind bars, earning the name the Snake for his slippery survival and ruthless strategy. From the streets of Brooklyn to the highest ranks of the Mafia, Persico's story is one of ambition, betrayal, and an empire built in shadows. As you close your eyes, imagine the secret meetings, the shifting loyalties, and the silent power that defined his reign. Before we begin, share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. And if you love sleeping stories of gangsters and forgotten empires, don't forget to subscribe and join our family. Now, settle in, and let the silence of the night take you deeper. Carmine John Persico Jr. was born on the 8th of August 1933 in Brooklyn, New York, to a working family that prized toughness and loyalty. The streets around Carroll Gardens and Red Hook taught lessons faster than any classroom. He had brothers, he had a tight circle, and he had a city that rewarded nerve. By his mid-teens, he drifted from school toward a local street crew. Police and reporters later tied him to the South Brooklyn Boys, a gang whose members graduated into larger organizations when they proved useful. He showed a quick mind, a steady demeanor, and a willingness to follow the old rule. Say little, do the job, get paid. As a teenager, he had his first major brush with the law. He was arrested in a homicide investigation stemming from a street fight. A brutal scrap that ended with a young man dead. News accounts from the time said he was very young, and the case later fell apart. He did not end up convicted. What remained was the reputation. Word spread that he could handle himself, that he could keep quiet when everyone else talked. Those qualities drew attention from older figures linked to the Persico crime family, the organization later known as the Colombo family. He moved from corner work and petty hustles, bookmaking, shylocking, and the muscle jobs that come with those rackets into circles where the money got bigger and the risks more permanent. In the 1,950 seconds, New York's underworld was redrawing its map. After the 1957 Appalachian fiasco, when bosses and capos were caught at a rural conference, the public learned just how structured these groups were. Back in Brooklyn, Joseph Persico still ran his family like a strict business, collecting tribute and keeping soldiers in line. Persico came up under men who dealt on President Street and Columbia Street, and for a time he worked alongside the Gallo brothers' crew, known for audacity and for testing the limits of obedience. Agencies saw Persico as a rising enforcer, an earner, someone who could collect debts, mediate disputes, and bring in steady returns. Allegations swirled that he was around for bigger things too, the kind of acts that shift power. Decades later, stories would surface claiming he had a role in notorious hits from that era, including the 1,957 killing of Albert Anastasia. Historians and law enforcement accounts disagree on that point, and no court ever convicted him in connection with it. Even so, the rumors boosted his aura inside a world where reputation shapes your next opportunity. By the end of the decade, small stresses within the Persico family cracked into open conflict. When Frankie Shots Abitamarco, a Brooklyn earner, fell out with the leadership and was murdered in 1959, the Gallo crew believed they were being used as workhorses without fair reward. In 1961, they pushed back. The Gallos kidnapped senior figures loyal to Persico to force concessions. What followed became known as the First Colombo War. Ambushes, drive-bys, and tense sit-downs scattered across Brooklyn and Queens. Persico had been friendly with the Gallo crew. Then, according to police files and later testimony, he switched his allegiance to the old guard. That pivot earned him a nickname he never lost. Some say it referred to his cunning. Others say it came from the feeling of being double-crossed by allies who thought he was theirs. What's clear is that he chose the side he believed would survive. One incident from that period defined his public image for years. In August 1961, Larry Gallo was lured to a Brooklyn bar for what he thought was a meeting. He was attacked in a back room, and witnesses later told police that a strangling cord appeared in the struggle. A responding officer stumbled in, chaos erupted, and the would-be killers fled. Newspapers splashed the ambush across their pages. Investigators suspected Persico had a hand in it. Courts did not return a conviction for that episode, yet the story became part of his legend. A quiet figure who shows up in the most dangerous moments and then seems to glide away. The war eventually cooled with agreements brokered by higher powers, but the trust inside the family had been shaken. The young men who survived were marked, for good and for ill. When Joseph Profaci died in 1962, his underboss Joseph Magliacco briefly took over, but fell, amid a broader plot that entangled major leaders across the city. The commission, the informal board composed of the bosses, forced changes, and in 1963 Joseph Colombo rose to lead the renamed Colombo family. Inside that reordering, Persico found space to grow. He assumed broader responsibilities, handled crews, and balanced a street reputation with an ability to navigate senior leadership. He loaned money at high interest and enforced the repayments. He safeguarded illegal gambling operations. He moved stolen goods. He inserted influence into labor locals near the docks and in parts of the building trades. None of this is a how-to manual. This is a record of what prosecutors later put in indictments and what cooperating witnesses described. The pattern matched New York's underworld. Money flowed through extortion, gambling, loan sharking, hijacking, and fraud, with violence held in reserve as a tool of control. The late 1960 seconds brought more law enforcement pressure. Federal and city agencies had begun to use wiretaps, informants, and conspiracy statutes to reach higher in the hierarchy. Persico was arrested on charges related to hijacking and other rackets, spending stretches behind bars and then returning to the street during appeals. Court records from that era show cases tied to theft of goods from trucks and warehouses, the kind of high-profit, high-risk plays that fed crews throughout the tri-state area. He did not speak to the press. He rarely left a trail of quotes. Instead, he built a reputation as someone who could run a crew even if he was temporarily away. Someone whose word held weight even from a jail cell. In 1971, the landscape shifted again when Joseph Colombo was shot at a public rally in Manhattan. He survived, but was incapacitated. With the boss unable to manage daily affairs, factions evolved. Senior figures tried to keep peace, but the reality was that influence was up for grabs. Persico advanced. By the mid-1970 seconds, he was recognized by law enforcement as a key decision-maker, often described as the de facto head of the Colombo family, even when he was serving time on older cases. He made appointments, approved promotions, granted permission for deals, and expected a cut of profits. This meant taking on responsibility for both the money and the fallout, every loan, every shakedown, every dispute that could flare into something worse. It also meant attracting federal attention at a level that never really left him. Despite his power, the 1970 seconds were not smooth. Investigators tied him to labor racketeering on the waterfront and in construction, to loan sharking schemes that trapped borrowers, and to protection payments that drained small businesses. He faced indictments, negotiated legal strategies, and learned to manage through intermediaries. This is where his long game showed. He rotated acting leaders, placed trusted relatives and old friends in crucial roles, and kept lines open with other families so that collaborative ventures like controlling pieces of the concrete industry stayed profitable. The stakes, however, kept rising. Prosecutors were building broader conspiracy cases using the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, which allowed them to stitch together a pattern of acts to prove leadership in a criminal enterprise. They were listening, mapping, and waiting. Alongside this hardening of his public identity, there was a home life that only occasionally reached headlines. He married young. He became a father. His sons Alphonse and Michael grew up in a house where respect for family was paramount, but where the risks were never far from the door. Relatives and neighbors remembered a man who could be charming and old-fashioned in manners, who made time for his children even while constantly moving between meetings and court dates. Those close to him understood the contradictions. He wanted to project stability, yet he thrived in a world where stability is always temporary. He learned to trust a small circle, to assume surveillance, and to communicate in ways that left little on paper. By the late 1970 seconds, he was firmly seen as the boss of the Colombo family, whether or not any formal ceremony had marked the moment. The business under his watch extended from Brooklyn into Queens, Staten Island, Long Island, and parts of New Jersey. Weaving through restaurants, trucking companies, unions, and contractors. Associates collected from numbers, games, guarded bookmakers, and carried messages. Soldiers made introductions, offered protection, and steered lucrative contracts. Victims rarely called these men protectors. They called them a cost of survival. The money moved upward through envelopes, coded calls, and meetings in coffee shops and social clubs, then outward again into bail funds, attorney fees, and investments that looked legitimate on the surface. It was a system that fed itself until someone broke ranks, or a microphone appeared where no one expected it. There were allegations that during this era he sanctioned retaliatory acts against rivals or defectors. Such claims surfaced in grand juries and at trials, sometimes confirmed by cooperating witnesses, sometimes contradicted by defense counsel. What is verifiable is that he was arrested, charged, and convicted for racketeering crimes that reflected the pattern of the family's operations: extortion, loan, sharking, illegal gambling, and schemes in the construction and trucking industries. He faced prison time and, again, managed the organization through appointed acting bosses while he was incarcerated. This cycle: arrest, trial, sentence, remote management, became his reality. It also fueled the government's view that only sweeping cases aimed at leadership could disrupt the system. As the 1,980 seconds dawned, a larger storm gathered. Federal prosecutors in Manhattan were assembling what would become one of the most significant organized crime cases in U.S. history, a case that treated New York's commission as a governing body subject to criminal liability. Their theory was simple: if the bosses jointly controlled industries, set rules, and profited from a coordinated structure, then the bosses could be charged together. That strategy required proof of meetings, shared ventures, and patterns of racketeering, proof they believed they had through bugs, tapes, and insider testimony. Persico's name was on the list. He had survived internal wars and leadership struggles. Now he faced a unified legal front unlike anything he had seen. Before that confrontation reached its climax, Persico continued to make moves from his position, balancing old alliances and new threats. He placed Victor Orena in a prominent role as an acting leader to steady day-to-day operations. He kept loyalty tight with relatives and longtime allies. He worked with other families on money-making projects, including the so-called Concrete Club, a rigged system of allocating large construction jobs to approved contractors in exchange for a piece of the profits. Law enforcement later proved the scheme in court, listing meetings, code names, and the flow of funds. Again, this is an explanation, not an endorsement. These acts hurt honest businesses, distorted markets, and spread fear among those who felt they had no choice but to pay. Every step brought him closer to a courtroom that would define the rest of his life. He had outlasted boyhood rivals, navigated shifts from Profaci to Colombo, and emerged as a rare figure who could control a family for years while spending long stretches behind bars. Yet the country around him had changed. Prosecutors were bolder. Jurors were ready to convict leaders based on the words of insiders. Old methods of insulation, no notes, no names, careful talk could not erase tapes made in social clubs and cars. The public's patience for excuses had waned. The message from the government was direct. Leadership brings responsibility. He understood that message. He had always understood the cost of authority in his world. He had worn the title and the target that came with it. In the years to come, he would represent himself in court, argue with the same tenacity he once used in back rooms, and receive a sentence so long it effectively wrote an end date on his freedom. But that is ahead of us. For now, see the young man who turned into the man in that quiet cell, the one running a finger along a legal pad, replaying old nights in a city that never really sleeps. Choices made under pressure, loyalties tested, profits counted, consequences delayed. This is the road he walked, and it is a road lined with victims and family, with power and loss, with a calm that hid constant danger. In that balance lived the person people came to know as Carmine Persico, and in that balance his story keeps unfolding. The storm that had been gathering over the skyline finally opened in 1984. Investigators had spent years tracing calls, taking notes outside diners, and listening to quiet rooms where business got done. Indictments rolled out naming leaders, soldiers, and close associates in a case built on patterns: loans with crushing terms, protection demands, hijacked truckloads, skimmed union benefits, and fixed bids on heavy construction. His name sat near the top. He knew what it meant. A public arrest would pull him straight into a courtroom glare. He slipped away instead, moving through borrowed houses and careful rides, trusting only a few relatives and old friends. While he was in hiding, the day-to-day work did not stop. Messages went out through couriers. Orders were delivered in short phrases. Meetings shrank to small circles in places where passing traffic made good cover. Even off the grid, he held control. Crews still collected gambling proceeds. Debtors still found collectors on their doorstep. Labor contacts still heard from intermediaries about which shop should get a contract and which should wait. Violence always loomed in that world, but it was never the first choice when money kept flowing. He tried to manage with minimal noise, which he had done since the old Profaci days. He did not trust phones. He preferred face-to-face talks or a line passed through someone who had nothing to prove. Long practice had taught him that a loose word can be worse than a loud threat. Agents watched relatives, raided apartments, and rounded up anyone with a hint of fresh information. After months on the run, the chase ended on Long Island in early 1985. He was arrested without drama. No public theatrics, no drawn-out chase across a highway. In photos taken soon after, he looked composed, as if the move from a safe address to a federal lockup was just the next meeting on his calendar. He was ushered through arraignment, hit with another sweeping set of charges, this time targeting what prosecutors said was a governing panel that set policy across families. He now faced two fronts: a Brooklyn case that focused on his own organization, and a Manhattan case that cast a much wider net. He surprised many observers when he chose to represent himself in the Brooklyn racketeering trial. It wasn't bluster. He had always been a quick study, someone who paid attention to process as closely as he tracked profits. In detention, he read case law, wrote motions, and learned the rhythms of federal court. He knew he could not charm a jury with easy stories, so he went for something else: control over the questions and the pace. Prosecutors presented evidence of a pattern of criminal activity stretching back years: loan sharking, extortion, illegal gambling, labor racketeering, and thefts from warehouses and trucks. Former insiders took the stand to describe how a debt might be enforced, how a bookmaker paid a tax to operate, how a contractor agreed to kick back a percentage to a life end of the 6A, keep a job site peaceful. None of it was romantic. It was money taken through fear or force, dressed up in phrases like taking care of business or keeping order. He cross-examined witnesses, challenged their motives, and pointed to gaps where dates or details didn't line up. The courtroom felt like a high-stakes sit-down, just with microphones and a jury box. The government still had the advantage. They linked tapes, ledgers, and testimony to show a pattern. The verdict in that case went against him. He was convicted on racketeering counts tied to extortion, loan sharking, and related conspiracies that reflected how the family earned and kept influence. Sentencing would come later, but the path was set. Decades behind federal walls were now likely. He did not flinch. He focused on the next trial looming across the river, a case even larger in scope. In Manhattan, prosecutors brought the commission theory into court, arguing that New York's top leaders had acted together to control key industries, especially concrete and other construction trades. They said the bosses coordinated which firms would land big jobs and how much those firms would quietly pay for the privilege. Surveillance had given them a map: car bugs capturing senior conversations, devices in social clubs catching snippets of strategy, and stacks of business records that showed how money moved from contractors to middlemen to the people at the top. His name appeared when decisions had to be made or disputes resolved. He was not the most talkative voice on those recordings, but he did not need to be for the government to argue that he sat at the table and shared in the power. Back in court, he delivered his own opening, questioned witnesses, and argued about what the law required the government to prove. He dressed neatly, spoke calmly, and kept his notes tight. Observers said he had poise. That did not change the evidence. Jurors listened to insiders who described the concrete club, where a handful of approved contractors won projects above a certain dollar value. They heard about union officials who faced quiet pressure to steer labor in ways that kept those deals safe. They saw how profit margins rose when competition fell. This was organized influence and organized theft at scale. And it drew the sort of sentences that erase decades. In late 1986, the jury returned guilty verdicts against the group of defendants, including him. The message from the bench during sentencing echoed the government's position. Leadership meant responsibility for the enterprise as a whole. He received a term so heavy that, combined with the earlier racketeering sentence from Brooklyn, it meant he would likely never again walk free. Numbers filled headlines. He listened, expression steady, then was led back to a holding cell where the echo of a closing door replaced the hum of city traffic. Appeals would follow. He would file them. None succeeded in a way that changed his future. Behind wire and concrete, he adjusted. He moved through high-security facilities built to contain men who still gave orders outside. The Bureau of Prisons monitored calls and visits. Lawyers acted as go-betweens. Some coded phrases survived, but the rules had tightened. Still, he retained standing. The organization he had shaped for years needed clear direction. He named an acting leader to manage daily matters, someone viewed as steady and diplomatic. Deals had to be vetted, disputes settled, and income kept steady enough to pay legal fees, support families of men doing time, and protect remaining business lines from competitors. He favored experience and kinship. Trusted relatives took on more responsibility. Men who had come up with him held key roles, and if someone drifted, he replaced them without fuss. Outside, the 1,980 seconds closed, with more pressure on labor rackets. Federal teams pushed into construction unions, longshore locals, and garbage carting. They tore into bid rigging and city contracts for window installations and other projects that used public money. They followed no-show jobs, where paychecks went to names who never lifted a tool. The goal was to cut off the oxygen. Less room to skim meant less money to pass up the line. Some cases landed, others stalled. The overall effect was to make every move riskier. His organization adapted, leaning harder into loan sharking, boosting sports betting, and chasing new frauds when old ones went cold. Every pivot added exposure. Inside, he settled into a routine built for endurance. Mornings began early. He exercised. He wrote letters that mixed family news, with careful notes about business. He saw his wife when she visited, watched his sons age between trips, and tried to be present without showing weakness. Men who had known him since the 1,950 seconds said the same thing. He did not panic. He accepted that power now meant influence from a room without a window, and he acted accordingly. Some nights he read case law, hunting for an angle that might shave time off his sentence. Other nights he replayed old choices, wondering which turn might have led to a quieter life. He kept those thoughts to himself. His influence remained a fact on the street. Even rival families recognized that decisions inside the Colombo structure still ran through his circle. That respect did not remove tension. Ambitious figures saw a chance to climb while the official boss was locked away. Old grievances resurfaced. The acting leader he had installed gained confidence, built his own following, and managed the flow of envelopes with a sure hand. Allies praised his calm. Critics whispered that he liked the spotlight too much. Balance inside a crew is delicate, especially when new money arrives or an arrest knocks out a key earner. Meanwhile, prosecutors kept watch on his children, nephews, and longtime friends. They knew that an enterprise does not stop because a leader is absent. They mapped family ties, flipped lower-level members who felt pressure, and looked for any opening to charge new cases. The message had not changed. If leadership made you wealthy, leadership would also be the reason you faced sweeping consequences. He had built his identity on loyalty. The state had built its strategy on patience. The two forces pulled at every seam. By the early 1,990 seconds, those seams began to tear. Rumors spread that the acting head wanted a permanent promotion and that he was reaching beyond the mandate he had been given. From behind bars, the old boss signaled that the title would not be surrendered. Those communications, filtered through visits and calls, set off a contest that would test every bond inside the family. Men chose sides. Meetings ended without agreement. Quiet pushes turned into open steps to control crews and revenue. Detectives noticed an uptick in surveillance targets circling the same addresses. Journalists caught wind that stress inside the Colombo family was turning into something harder, something that would spill across Brooklyn blocks where kids still rode bikes after school and shopkeepers just wanted a calm summer. He had seen it before: the split between loyalty and ambition. The feeling that someone who had earned their place now faced a challenge from someone who had not. Age had not changed the basic equation. What had changed were the stakes. With federal sentences stretching across lifetimes and tapes catching what once stayed private, any internal conflict would open doors for the government to step deeper into private rooms. He knew that. So did his acting leader. Neither man yielded. The tug of war set the stage for a period that would mark the family for years to come. None of it would bring peace. None of it would bring leniency from judges already tired of hearing about the life. Yet momentum is its own force. Once it gathers, it is hard to slow. In letters that left his cell, he asked loyalists to stay disciplined, to follow the structure that had carried them through earlier storms, to keep money flowing but avoid loud moves that draw cameras. He reminded them that their strength had always been patience and order. He wanted a transition that protected his relatives and preserved the system he built. The men who read those letters had their own worries. Some feared losing their place. Some feared jail. Some simply feared being on the wrong side of the next decision. The days when he could walk into a social club and end a dispute with a nod were gone. He was now a voice coming through glass or ink on paper. That was enough for some. It was not enough for others. Through it all, the public kept a kind of uneasy fascination. They saw headlines about conspiracies to control cement pours, about contracts steered to safe firms, about envelopes with unrecorded payments. They saw grainy photos of a compact man with sharp features walking into court in a suit, knowing that whatever happened in that room would ripple far beyond it. They did not see the cost carried by small businesses forced to pay, or by workers who handed union dues to men who never represented them. Those costs were real. They outlasted the drama. He had chosen his road long before the federal cases stacked up. In the 1,950 seconds, it had looked like a path to status. In the 1,970 seconds, it looked like a chessboard he could master. By the 1,980 seconds, it had become a series of court dates marching toward a number that sounded more like a calendar century than a prison term. Still, he kept his posture. He had lived by rules he accepted as a teenager. He would not break them now. The years ahead would show how that resolve played out when others decided not to wait for his blessing. The calm voice from the cell would soon meet street noise he could no longer lower by walking into the room himself. In the early 1,990 seconds, the pressure inside his organization became impossible to ignore. The man he had placed in charge on the street had grown comfortable in the chair. That acting boss had a following, money, and the confidence that comes with running day-to-day decisions. From a prison unit, the longtime leader sent word that the arrangement was temporary. The reply came back in actions, not in words. Crews shifted their loyalties. Meetings ran longer and ended tenser. Old friendships thinned out under the weight of ambition. People who had been close since the Profaci years found themselves choosing sides. Law enforcement could tell the atmosphere changed. Surveillance teams noticed the same cars circling the same blocks at odd hours. Informants said sit-downs were breaking down over who controlled bookmakers, who collected from loan clients, and who set the pace for union influence. The acting boss, Victor Arena, felt he had earned the top spot. He had kept the gears turning while the official head fought appeals. Supporters rallied to him. Opponents said the title was not his to claim. Persico's messages from inside were steady. The crown stays put. That stance, carried out through careful visits and coded phone calls, collided with a man who did not want to give the chair back. By the summer of 1991, the argument turned open. Brooklyn storefronts with back rooms once used for quiet talks became places where plans were made and counterplans imagined. Shots were fired on side streets and near driveways. Targets ducked ambushes or didn't. Neighborhoods that had lived with underworld shadows for decades felt the temperature rise. Owners pulled down metal gates before sunset. Parents hurried kids off stoops. Detectives mapped incidents and saw patterns that pointed to two poles: the jailed boss's loyalists and the acting boss's circle. The older man had seen internal fights before. In the 1,960 seconds, he'd chosen a side and outlasted rival crews. But this was different. Technology had changed. Federal strategy had changed. Every move now risked a wiretap, a tail, or a flipped insider. Even so, he could not allow what he viewed as an appointment to be turned into a permanent takeover. He leaned on family ties and his oldest allies to hold ground. Those men, some of whom knew him since the South Brooklyn Boys era, dug in. The Arena camp pushed back. The result was a prolonged struggle that historians now call The Third Colombo War. A destructive stretch that ran roughly from mid-1991 into 1993. During this period, prosecutors formed joint squads and brought sweeping racketeering complaints. They described a picture of two factions competing to control revenue streams, sports betting operations, cards and numbers, loan sharking portfolios, slices of union funds, and protection routes tied to construction and trucking. The cases laid out how collections were scheduled, how interest rates trapped borrowers, and how contractors paid to avoid sabotage on job sites. Violence was part of the story, but the indictments focused on the structure. An enterprise run by intimidation and fraud, not just sudden street attacks. That approach fit the RICO model used throughout the 1,980 seconds and early 1,990 seconds. One development from that time became a scandal on its own. A Persico loyalist named Gregory Scarpa, a longtime enforcer with a fearsome reputation, turned out to have been a secret government source for years. His status became public later, raising questions about oversight and the quality of some investigations. In courtrooms, defense attorneys argued that the war had been affected by informant manipulation. Prosecutors countered that the core facts remained. Two groups fought for control of rackets. Civilians were endangered, and the organization's practices extortion, illegal gambling, loan, sharking, fraud, and labor corruption hurt honest workers and businesses. Whatever the debate about particular episodes, the war only strengthened the state's hand. Chaos invites attention, and attention brought charges. Orina's side took heavy legal hits. In 1992, agents arrested him after months of pursuit. He faced racketeering counts that included attempted murders during the conflict, extortion, and control of illegal gambling. Trials moved fast by organized crime standards. Witnesses included former insiders who chose cooperation when prison terms loomed. Jurors convicted Orina, and a federal judge handed down a life sentence. With their chief in custody, many of his supporters either switched sides, cut deals with prosecutors, or went away on long terms. The jailed boss had won the power struggle in a narrow sense. The wider cost was severe. His own legal posture remained unchanged. He had already been convicted in two major federal cases: the Brooklyn racketeering trial, where a judge gave him 39 years, and the Manhattan Commission case, which added a consecutive 100-year term. Those numbers effectively guaranteed that he would spend the rest of his days in federal custody. Even so, he was named in new filings connected to the family war. Some counts were trimmed as cases evolved. Others proceeded against men on the street. Through lawyers, he continued to assert that he governed to keep order and never authorized reckless acts. Prosecutors, bolstered by cooperating witnesses such as the family's former consigliere Carmine Persico, said the opposite, that directives from the top fueled the conflict, and that the enterprise's core activities were built on coercion. The legal outcomes underscored a reality. Leadership brings broad liability under conspiracy and RICO statutes. After the arrests, the organization restructured. Acting roles shifted to figures with deep ties to the Persico bloodline and to the old President Street circle. Andrew Mush Russo, a respected cousin, served stretches in senior positions. Thomas Gioeli rose later. Persico's son, Alphonse, Alley Boy, emerged as a key voice when he was free, reflecting the boss's view that family was the most reliable bond. The message throughout the ranks was simple: keep earning steady, stop public outbursts, and avoid anything that could reopen a war. Stability meant survival. On the street, however, the environment had changed permanently. The war had drawn attention from every level of government. Joint state-federal operations pressed deeper into longshore unions, ready-mix concrete, and sanitation carting. Separate prosecutors in Manhattan and Brooklyn pursued the Windows investigation, a large case alleging that several families, including the Colombos, fixed bids and steered multi-million-dollar contracts for public housing window replacement. That prosecution produced convictions against prominent figures across families, hardened the impression that organized crime distorted markets at scale, and made clear that industry-wide schemes were no longer safe harbors. While Persico was not a defendant in that case, it hit his network's money lines and showed how cooperation among families could be turned against them in court. Inside prison, he adjusted to the long haul. He read transcripts, annotated rulings, and filed appeals and habeas petitions. He rarely spoke to reporters. Visitors described him as polite, measured, and focused. He maintained the persona that had helped him survive the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds. Calm, disciplined, and aware that patience is a kind of power. He never considered cooperation. That choice came with a price. Each avenue he would not take left him with only incremental legal moves challenging a guideline, questioning a hearsay ruling, testing a procedural point. None of it undid the two central convictions that defined his sentence. The people around him felt the ripple effects. His wife kept the home front steady. Children and nephews carried the name and, with it, scrutiny. Associates who had once found comfort in the organization's routines now found them riskier. Simple acts, picking up an envelope, making a call, sitting at a table with old friends, could be cited as evidence in a conspiracy case. Younger earners looked for quieter ways to make money, shifting into fraud that used phones and fax lines rather than street corners. Older hands stayed with the familiar: sports books, card rooms, and loans at hard terms. Through it all, the directive from the top remained: silence, order, restraint. The public narrative around him moved between fascination and fatigue. Documentaries and books framed him as a figure of endurance, a man who became and remained a boss while serving unending time. Those same accounts, when careful, also posted the ledger of harm. Businesses paying under threat. Workers stuck with union leaders who served private interests. Neighborhoods unsettled by sudden flare-ups. Courts, for their part, treated him as the symbol of a system they meant to dismantle. Sentences for anyone close to his orbit grew heavier in the 1,990 seconds than they had been in earlier decades. Judges invoked deterrence and the need to protect the public as reasons to stack years. Inside the family, the truce after the war held, but only because the cost of another break was clear. The Orena faction had been crushed. Its remaining adherents tried to keep a low profile or find protection by shifting alliances. Persico's circle insisted on loyalty checks. Promotions went to people with long, traceable ties: relatives, childhood friends, men who had passed tests without turning informant. The everyday business stayed familiar, collecting on debts, absorbing small, independent gambling outfits, seeking leverage in union locals that could influence concrete pours and deliveries. Investigations continued to chip at those operations with wiretaps, cooperating witnesses, and undercover work. As the decade closed, more indictments arrived. Some targeted Persico's closest kin, who had stepped into leadership roles. Others charged soldiers with the classic set of crimes: extortion schemes, rackets around sports betting, and loan sharking operations that escalated when borrowers stalled. The pattern established in prior years held: indictments, pleas by lower ranks, a handful of trials ending in convictions, and a new round of acting appointments to fill emptied chairs. Stability came not from safety but from adaptation. If you look at the arc of his life to this point, the boy in Brooklyn, the young enforcer, the strategist who outlasted rivals, the boss convicted in historic trials, you see a person who played a long game and accepted its penalties. He excelled at keeping a structure intact, even when he could not walk its streets. He also left a trail of damage: businesses drained, public works steered away from fair bids, families disrupted by sentences and by sudden street violence. This telling does not celebrate that. It records it. He believed in a code that rewarded patience, family, and silence. The state believed in a different code: statutes that turn a pattern into a case, testimony into years, and a name into a cautionary example. He kept writing, kept counseling discipline, kept the family's books of memory in his head: the favors owed, the lines not to cross, the men who had proven themselves. Letters moved across steel and glass, short and purposeful. Phone calls stayed brief. Trusted emissaries carried the rest. The circle never broadened more than necessary. That restraint, learned young, remained his safest habit. It could not shorten a 139-year sentence. It could, however, keep his structure from cracking again under the stress of ego and impatience. Beyond the clatter of headlines, the war years left an imprint that never entirely faded. The organization operated, but everyone understood what another internal dispute would invite. Detectives remembered addresses. Prosecutors kept binders ready. Journalists kept files open. Any return to open conflict would bring the same avalanche raids at dawn, indictments with long lists, and families waiting outside courthouses for outcomes few expected to change. That knowledge acted like a brake. If money came in slower, so be it. Quiet was now a kind of prophet. He had entered the life when he was barely more than a boy, drawn by respect and the chance to matter in a corner of the city that measured worth in nerve. By the early 1992, the world he helped lead stood at a permanent crossroads. One way led to a fragile peace under a jailed boss's steady hand. The other led back to the storm everyone had just survived. He did what he had always done, chose order over noise, ritual over impulse, structure over spectacle. Whether that choice helped the city is for others to judge. What it did do was keep his name central to an organization that, despite pressure from courts and cops, still took his calls and still passed his instructions, a fact that says as much about the pull of loyalty as it does about the stubborn reach of a man who never stepped away. The uneasy quiet that followed the street war felt fragile, like glass that could spider with a careless touch. For people inside the life, the lesson was simple. Noise brings raids, raids bring indictments, and indictments turn into years that no one can bargain away. From a cell far from President Street, the old boss pressed that lesson into every message he sent. He wanted discipline over bravado, checks over cheers, and a steady income that stayed off the front page. He had lived through enough storms to know that victories in that world often look like silence. Restructuring began with familiar faces. Men who had grown up alongside him, or under him, took positions that required judgment more than muscle. Andrew Russo, a cousin who understood the balance between profit and caution, cycled through senior roles. Others, with deep roots, held crews together, smoothing out bad blood left from the split with the acting boss who had refused to step down. Promotions favored trust over flash. A name meant something if it came with decades of proof, keeping books balanced, keeping tempers down, and keeping meetings short. Outside, agencies did not loosen their grip. Joint squads seated informants across construction trades, trucking routes, and longshore locals. Investigators dug into no-show payrolls, and vendor lists padded to create slush streams. They followed how contractors padded bids for government work, and how pieces of those inflated margins drifted into private pockets. When the Windows case broke an investigation into multi-million-dollar public housing window contracts steered by several families, it reinforced a national lesson. Collusion in city contracts had been treated as routine for years. Now it was evidence. While that case focused more heavily on other families, the fallout hit the wider network, including people who answered to him. Margins shrank. Scrutiny rose. Soft threats that once kept labor calm now carried microphones. He kept the family's internal calendar ticking. Birthdays, wakes, anniversaries of old bosses' dates that signaled respect stayed on the schedule, yet the gatherings grew smaller and more cautious. Social clubs that once ran lively back rooms looked quieter. Public displays drew too much attention. The official boss had become a figure seen in photos clipped from older papers or captured in a courthouse hallway before a marshal moved him along. Influence flowed through letters, legal visits, and the coded shorthand of old relationships. One truth guided his appointments. Blood stays when friends fall away. He believed that family bonds create the strongest seal against betrayal. That view shaped a plan to place his son, Alphonse, in a leadership role whenever circumstances allowed. Ali had the name, understood the rules, and had plenty to prove. He had also spent time in federal custody himself, learning firsthand how quickly a case can grow from whispers into sentencing numbers. When he was free in the mid to late 1990s, he became the central voice on the street for the Persico line. Veterans like John Jackie DeRoss, a loyalist and steady hand, stood near him, defending the hierarchy that kept the old boss in place, even as decades piled up behind prison walls. That arrangement did not sit well with everyone. William Wild Bill Cutolo, a force in Brooklyn with money, charisma, and broad support, represented a rival center of gravity. He had stature from the earlier conflict, access to earners, and a reputation as a leader who could move people. Rumors swirled that he wanted more say in how money moved, and who wore the title. In organizations run by tacit codes and quiet votes, Such shifts either get absorbed with grace or end abruptly. In May 1999, Cotolo vanished after leaving for a supposed meeting. He did not return to his routine, did not call home, did not reappear at known haunts. Years later, prosecutors would say he had been killed on orders from the street leadership that answered to the jailed boss. Courts would convict Ali and DeRoss for that murder and associated racketeering, using testimony from insiders who turned government witness. The indictment framed the disappearance as a decisive act to settle succession and control, a grim instrument for enforcing a dynasty. Defense attorneys denied that narrative. Juries accepted the government's view. The impact inside the family was immediate. Whatever debate had remained on the street tilted toward the Persico side. Dissenters either lowered their voices or prepared for a fight they could not win. Collections continued. Sports betting, card rooms, and loan books produced steady income, even if the margins thinned under pressure. Labor contacts still mattered, though every conversation carried the suspicion that a recorder might be nearby. The smart move, what the old boss had preached, was to avoid stunts. Better a smaller number that arrives on time than a blaze that burns the whole structure down. The 2000s brought another wave of cases. Federal teams in Brooklyn and Manhattan assembled indictments that read like organizational charts: boss, acting boss, underboss, consigliere, captains, soldiers, associates. They tied names to extortion schemes against small businesses, to pressure on contractors, to loans with crushing interest, to gambling operations that thrived around sports seasons. Some counts targeted theft of benefits from union welfare and health funds, a particularly harsh form of exploitation because it drained the safety nets for working families. Trial testimony described cash envelopes, no work positions that bled employers, and subtle threats that kept targets from reporting abuse. Again, none of this is a handbook for harm. It is a record of how prosecutors said the money flowed, and why courts imposed long sentences on people who made that system run. Even after so many years behind bars, he remained the Axis. People on the street still referred to him by his nickname. Requests for appointments and promotions moved through trusted messengers. When a defendant wanted to argue that they were small players, prosecutors showed how their cuts rose to a leadership chain that never surrendered real authority. In narrative after narrative, his name anchored the enterprise. That presence irritated defense teams who wanted to sever cases from a boss serving a centuries-long term. It also energized prosecutors who used his longevity to argue that the only effective response to racketeering was heavy punishment aimed at the top. There were moments when legal news brushed against him in unexpected ways. Revelations about Gregory Scarpa's work as a secret source for federal agents became public with more detail. Scarpa, a violent Persico loyalist who had died in 1994, had fed information to the government while also committing serious crimes. Defense lawyers in various cases used that history to question the credibility and oversight of investigations tied to the Colombo family's bloody years. Judges sorted through those claims carefully. Some specific charges were affected by informant taint. The central picture, though a family bound by extortion, gambling, loan sharking, fraud, and labor corruption, remained intact in court findings. Scarpa's double life raised hard questions about law enforcement methods. It did not rewrite the legal record that kept the old boss in prison. In custody, he grew older, but not idle. He was transferred through different facilities over the decades, including high-security prisons designed to contain inmates who held sway outside. Daily life settled into a pattern: exercise, reading, legal research, scheduled phone calls monitored by staff, and visits conducted with glass between participants. He kept notes in a precise hand, replayed trial transcripts, and looked for procedural flaws that might open a small door toward relief. None swung wide. Appeals were denied. Petitions were dismissed or stalled. A 139-year combination of sentences remained unbudgeable. He accepted that reality without public complaint. The people closest to him carried his choices as their own burdens. His wife kept a home that lived under watchful eyes. Children grew to middle age with a last name that opened some doors in certain circles and closed many more elsewhere. His son's prosecution over the 1,999 disappearance put family pain into stark relief. Relatives sitting in benches, listening to former allies testify, hearing jurors speak the word guilty with no room to bargain. That next generation bore the same code. Loyalty, silence, order, but faced a different world. Cameras hung on corners, phones recorded. Juries had heard the mafia story enough times to fill a bookshelf. Romance faded in the face of routine harm. Despite the pressure, the organization did not fold. It adapted. The labor rackets grew more complex, evolving into consulting angles and subcontracting arrangements that looked legitimate at a glance. Fraud shifted into newer channels: telemarketing scams, healthcare claims, and internet-age cons that used distance instead of fists to keep victims quiet. Some of those plays touched other families. Cooperation across groups remained part of the underworld toolkit. The old boss could not have foreseen the exact shape of those hustles in his early days, but he recognized the strategy: find a choke point, claim a toll, and punish defiance. The state recognized it too, and responded with the same statute that had brought him down years earlier. Rico's design, turning a pattern of smaller acts into a single enterprise case, fit the times. His personal legend kept drawing writers and filmmakers. Each new project painted him in one of two lights: a survivor with a sharp mind for strategy, or a symbol of stubborn harm that clung to neighborhoods long after people wanted it gone. Often, the same piece tried to do both. What the public rarely saw were the mundane details that filled his days: the quiet discipline he used to endure, the consistency needed to run anything over decades, even something illegal. That steadiness never excused the damage. It showed how a certain temperament, calm, controlled, unflashy, can make a structure durable, for good or ill. The early 2000s also brought health concerns that come with age and confinement. He managed them like everything else. By gathering information and following a routine. Diets tightened. Exercise kept to a measured plan. He knew that strength in that environment is less about size than about consistency. Guards and inmates alike described him as respectful. He demanded the same in return. Trouble did not swirl around him inside. He let his name do the work it always had, and he kept his movements narrow. More indictments hit the family as the decade moved forward. Andrew Russo faced fresh charges tied to racketeering and labor extortion. Other veterans were named in cases involving threats to a union benefit fund and schemes inside construction and trucking. Many defendants pleaded guilty, calculating that a sure number was better than rolling dice with a jury. Those who went to trial often lost. Each conviction added another caution to the ledger for anyone tempted to step into a role that required meetings at odd hours and phone calls that never lasted past a minute. Meanwhile, the Persico line still provided the blueprint for how promotions would work: steady, conservative, favoring men who had proven themselves under scrutiny. Through all of this, his view of himself did not change. He saw a life of decisions made under the rules he accepted before he could grow a full beard. He believed in the idea that order in his world prevented worse outcomes: fewer public outbursts, fewer uncontrolled feuds, a code that kept chaos at bay. Critics, including judges and prosecutors, pointed to victims who paid debts that never ended, contractors pushed into sham bids, and union members whose benefits evaporated. Those facts sit side by side. Any honest telling of his life has to hold both: the internal logic that guided him and the social cost that followed his choices across generations. He aged in place as the 2010 seconds began. Younger inmates whispered about the legend who had represented himself at a historic trial and still managed to run a family across a continent of fences. Older inmates nodded at a man who had kept his composure while calendars turned and relatives grew old without him. News clippings about the Colombo family still found their way into the mail. New arrests, new pleas, occasional acquittals that surprised commentators who thought certain outcomes were foregone. From a small desk under a fluorescent light, he measured each headline against decades of memory, noting patterns others might miss. Outside, the neighborhood where he grew up continued to change. Coffee shops turned into bakeries with white tile and bright lights. Tenements gave way to renovated brownstones with clean facades. The social clubs that once offered shade for street business either closed or turned into something else entirely. Newcomers walked dogs past corners that had hosted sit-downs or celebrations of old bosses. The city did what cities do: it moved on. Inside the life, some men adapted, others retired, and a few tried to hold to old rhythms in a place that no longer hummed the same tune. If you trace the arc from the early 1000 990 seconds to the mid-2010 seconds, you see constancy in one dimension. He remained the recognized leader of a shrinking, shifting, stubbornly persistent enterprise. That endurance came from a particular blend of traits: patience, caution, loyalty to a small circle, and a refusal to fall into the trap of public bravado. It also came at the expense of people who never chose to be part of that world, who paid because someone told them the cost of refusing would be worse. The balance sheet of his life was never simple. It held profit and principle on one side, fear and loss on the other. The story was not over. Age had slowed him, but had not cut him off from the only structure he had ever truly trusted. He still believed he could insulate the people he loved by managing the temperature of the street from afar. He still believed that a hierarchy, even under siege, offered more stability than chaos. Whether that belief could withstand the next round of arrests, health scares, and internal tests remained to be seen. The city kept breathing. So did he, waking before dawn to the familiar hum of a vent, and the knowledge that every day behind a locked door was one more day to hold tight to an identity forged on Brooklyn sidewalks long ago. Age pressed in without changing his habits. Dawn still belonged to a short workout, a shower that ran just long enough to clear the mind, and a seat at a metal desk with a pen and a stack of notes. Across the decades, that rhythm had softened storms and kept him from drifting into bitterness. A disciplined routine, a small circle, and a belief that order beats display, those were the tools that had carried him from crowded Brooklyn blocks to the center of a criminal enterprise and, later, through years of concrete and steel. From time to time, a guard or a visiting lawyer would remark that his manner felt almost old world. Calm tone, tidy suit on court days, precise questions, no wasted motion. It wasn't charm. It was control, the same trait that once made him useful to older men and later made him unavoidable to prosecutors. On the street, the structure he nurtured tried to look smaller than it was. Crews kept sports books running and collected on old debts while avoiding barroom talk that could float into the wrong ears. Family contacts near union halls learned to speak in half phrases. Trusted go-betweens mixed business updates with neighborhood chatter so that any line read later might sound like nothing at all. He had insisted on that style since the first days of wiretaps. It made sense in an age when a jacket pocket could hide a recorder and a car roof could hold a microphone. It also fit his nature. Stay measured. Say less. Expect patience. The next big crackdown arrived in the early 2010 seconds. Coordinated arrests swept up veterans and younger figures linked by blood, marriage, or years spent earning under the same bosses. Indictments traced familiar outlines: extortion of contractors, loans with punishing terms, pressure on union benefit funds, and illegal gambling that surged around big sporting seasons. Prosecutors highlighted the names who kept the Persico line intact. A cousin who had long moved between upper roles, Andrew Russo, faced counts tied to racketeering and labor extortion. A nephew known for discipline and potential, Theodore, was charged in a separate case and later took a plea that sent him away for a significant stretch. His younger son, Michael, was drawn into a federal case and eventually admitted guilt on a racketeering-related charge tied to loan sharking. Each development reinforced a point the government had made since the 1,980 seconds. The structure persisted. It raised money through coercive means, and the boss's family remained central. Trials from that period complicated the picture without changing the headline. A former acting street boss known for a hard edge, Tommy Gioli, became the focus of a case that revisited older violence alongside racketeering counts. Jurors acquitted on the most explosive allegations, but returned guilty verdicts on enterprise crimes. The takeaway for people inside the life was blunt. Even when the state missed on individual acts from the past, the broader enterprise case extortion, bookmaking, loan sharking, and fraud often held up. The message from federal judges grew sharper: long terms for senior figures, significant time for soldiers who enforced rules with threats, and strict supervised release conditions for anyone lucky enough to come home. From his desk, the old boss watched those outcomes in clippings mailed by relatives and summaries prepared by counsel. He marked names with pencil, noted relationships in margins, and kept track of who stayed solid. When a man took a plea without dragging others into it, that fact joined a mental ledger he had maintained since the 1,950 seconds. Loyalty remained the currency that mattered most to him. It had brought him close to power, had hardened when old friends became rivals, and had kept him from ever considering cooperation, even as his sentence guaranteed that he would die a prisoner. Whether that loyalty served the wider city was never the question in his mind. The code existed before he was born. He measured himself by it. Reporters, authors, and documentarians kept circling his story. They wrote about the boy from Carroll Gardens who survived the Gallo conflict, about the man prosecutors called a mastermind of racketeering, about the defendant who insisted on defending himself in a trial that became a national event. They remembered the nickname that rivals gave him, pointing to the moment in the early 1960 seconds when he shifted allegiances during a family war and gained a label he would never shed. They also stressed a different moniker that grew over time, a nod to how he outlasted enemies and court cases alike. Pieces like these sold because they offered a window into a closed world. The careful ones didn't glamorize. They mapped how intimidation and fraud twist markets, burden workers, and leave neighborhoods wary of speaking up. Inside, his world narrowed, but didn't dim. He kept up with his children, and, when allowed, his grandchildren. Photos of family events arrived with soft corners from being passed around. On visits, voices rose and fell under the watch of staff trained to catch any hint of coded talk. He avoided that trap. Family talk stayed family talk. Business talk ran through attorneys or intermediaries who had already learned to keep it brief and vague. He never forgot the reality that every call could be recorded, every envelope opened, every visitor questioned. That awareness had become second nature after decades of practice. The organization outside continued to evolve, adopting pressure points that fit a more regulated city. Instead of crude threats at a job site, there might be the quiet reminder that a late delivery could stall a concrete pour, or that a labor issue might suddenly appear if an envelope didn't move. Fraud drifted into bureaucratic corners contracting subclauses, sham consulting, and billing practices that made ordinary businesses look complicit even when they felt trapped. Law enforcement adapted as well, embedding financial analysts in squads, building cases with bank records and emails rather than only tapes and turncoats. For people inside the life, this meant that the old instinct to avoid microphones wasn't enough. Paper trails, spreadsheets, and text messages could tell a story no one meant to write. He understood that the city around him was not the place he had learned as a teenager. Carroll Gardens and Cobble Hill had shifted from rough edges to calm streets where people pushed strollers past bakeries lit like galleries. Red Hook had artists and visitors on weekends. Social clubs that had once served as community centers and private offices either disappeared or became relics. Yet the old networks didn't vanish. Bonds forged over decades find ways to survive, and some habits do not yield to time. For the state, that persistence justified new waves of indictments. For him, it explained why he still took calls from men who spoke of him with a mix of respect and fear, men who believed that a voice from far away could still steady a dispute. Health took up more space in his days as the years wore on. The walks around a small yard grew shorter and steadier. Medical appointments replaced some of the time he once gave to reading case law. An aging inmate learns to make peace with the slow pace of care in a large system. He did, and he adapted. He asked pointed questions, listened to doctors, and followed advice. Pride didn't get in the way of practicality. Strength meant consistency, not bravado. From time to time, attempts at legal relief surfaced. Lawyers filed motions challenging aspects of his sentencing, arguing about enhancements, and citing shifts in federal law that trimmed mandatory minimums for others. He did not expect miracles. Courts had long since affirmed the central convictions: the racketeering case tied to his family's operations and the commission case that treated bosses as a governing board responsible for coordinated schemes. Still, he kept at it. Filing a motion was not only a legal act, it was a way of showing his people that he remained engaged and alert, that he still carried himself as the head of something designed to outlast any one man. Younger figures looked to him for cues on strategy. The answer they got was always some version of the same: stay quiet, keep books clean enough to pass a glance, don't test judges with public antics, and remember that the smart money is the money no one notices. That view had guided him since the first days he collected on debts for older men. It had also shaped the way he handled internal dissent. When challenges surfaced after the 1990 Seconds War, they were met without slogans or public shows. Decisions came down in small rooms and on short notes. The 1,999 disappearance of a prominent street figure, an event prosecutors later tied to leaders trained in his mold, remained a point of cautionary memory for anyone tempted to test the chain of command. That case, tried years later, sent his son and a senior aide away for long terms and hardened the sense that the Persico line would not yield control. As the 2010 seconds advanced, the Colombo name appeared in headlines less frequently than in earlier waves, but the content stayed familiar. Cases alleged fresh pressure on a laborer's local. Separate filings described attempts to siphon from health funds. Another round targeted sports betting networks that used runners and credit sheets to avoid obvious cash movement. Defendants often took pleas. Those who went all the way to juries gambled with long odds. Judges, citing deterrence and the need to protect the public, issued numbers that told younger earners a hard truth. The old days of short bids were gone. His own days took on a quieter shape. A book on the table might be history, a legal volume, or an old novel passed along by a neighbor in the unit. He wrote letters in a compact hand that wasted no words. He tracked birthdays, sent regards to families of men doing time, and kept a list of favors done for him long ago that still deserved recognition. Small acts like these maintained morale. An enterprise built on fear alone breaks easily. He had always balanced pressure with a sense of membership, reinforcing the idea that belonging offered protection and dignity even when the law pressed in. Whether that feeling matched reality was another matter, but the sentiment helped keep a system running. From outside, former associates who had left the life looked back with a mix of relief and regret. Some went on the record in books or interviews, describing him as unflappable, a man who could listen to heated talk, nod once, and make a decision everyone followed. Others criticized what they saw as needless rigidity, a refusal to adapt the hierarchy to a changing world that fueled fresh cycles of prison and loss. Both views landed at his door, and neither changed his course. He believed that a clear chain of command and a narrow circle prevented chaos. Alter that, and the house falls. City politics and policing shifted across those years, yet one constant remained. Organized crime, adapted to opportunity. The same bridges he once used between labor, trucking, and construction now appeared in new forms, through subcontracting and consulting, through friends of friends who steered introductions. Federal teams tracked those lines, and when they found enough, they moved. Each time they did, his name returned as context, the historical force behind a pattern that persisted. In that way, he became part of New York's institutional memory, a reference point for agents training on cold cases, and for prosecutors writing their first big indictments. Time wore down the edges of anger while leaving convictions intact. He did not complain about food, cell assignments, or the 1,000 small inconveniences that can grind a person down. Control of self matters in confinement. It projects strength and builds private space in a public setting. That discipline, the thing that once helped him stay alive on the street, served him as he entered his 9th decade. Not many from his era lasted that long with their reputations still intact among loyalists. Fewer still managed to remain, in practical terms, the acknowledged head of a family from so far away for so many years. The city that formed him still appeared in his thoughts at night, the old storefronts on Columbia Street, the smell of bread in the morning, the shuffle of cards in a back room where someone kept track of who could be trusted. Those images did not make him sentimental. They were inventory, not romance. A lifetime of choices had given him position and taken his freedom. He weighed both facts without self-pity. If there was a lesson he pressed on younger relatives, it was one he rarely said out loud. Every decision has a bill attached, and the bill always arrives, even if it takes half a century to find you. By the time winter settled over the Carolinas one year, and holidays passed with their familiar ache, he had become a study in endurance. Papers still called him a living link to an earlier generation of bosses. Agents still spoke his name as shorthand for an approach that valued patience, caution, and family ties above flash. Supporters still looked to him for guidance, and critics still pointed to the people and institutions that paid the price for a system that turned fear into income. Both sides told pieces of the truth. He kept to his routine, answered the calls he was allowed, and watched another calendar turn, fully aware that the institutions that held him and the network that still invoked him would both outlast any one man. The slow march of years did not change the cadence of his days, only the weight carried in each hour. He woke before the lights, stretched in a narrow space, and counted breaths until the unit stirred. Coffee from a plastic mug, a short walk where a strip of sky showed through fencing, then back to the desk where letters and legal notes waited. News drifted in with the mail. Fresh cases on the street, old names resurfacing, the occasional surprise acquittal. He penciled circles around people he still trusted and underlined those who had stumbled. Even from far away, he managed the only way he knew, through steadiness, through a code that measured a person by what they did under pressure and what they refused to say when saying it would bring comfort. The Eastern District kept its tempo through the early 2010 seconds. One sweep brought in a roster that looked like a family tree. Veterans who had sat at tables since the 1970 seconds. Mid-level captains who managed sports books and loan ledgers, and younger men whose confidence came from blood ties. The case mapped extortion of contractors who worked night shifts pouring concrete, pressure on union officials who controlled access to crews, and loans that turned late payments into traps. At the top, prosecutors wrote the same thesis they had carried for decades. The Persico line remained the center of gravity, reasserting control whenever a vacancy appeared. Andrew Russo's arrest signaled that the old guard had not retired. Separate filings named Theodore, a nephew marked for leadership, but pulled off the board by a racketeering plea, and Michael, the younger son, who admitted to running a loan-sharking book and accepted a term that kept him away while his father aged. It was a family portrait painted in indictments. Another courtroom revisited the past as Tommy Joyely faced claims linking him to old murders and to the daily work of the enterprise. Jurors rejected the most sensational counts, including the killing of an off-duty officer, but convicted on racketeering. The split verdict taught a familiar lesson. Proving individual acts from long ago is hard. Proving a continuing pattern of extortion, gambling, and loans is simpler when records, calls, and insiders line up. Sentencing memoranda spelled out harm in plain language: business owners who paid because they feared trouble, workers whose benefits were siphoned, a market tilted by threats rather than price. Judges cited deterrence and public protection, then set numbers that matched the theory. From his side of the glass, the old boss tracked these outcomes and sent back the same counsel he had given since the 1960 seconds. Keep the profile low, keep money flowing without public noise, and keep disputes quiet. He had known showmen and watched them fall. His style was different. He preferred the man who counted quietly in a corner to the one who told stories at a bar. That preference shaped how he weighed promotions. After the 1990 seconds war, after the 1999 disappearance that prosecutors tied to his circle, after the 2009 life sentences handed to his son Alphonse and Jackie DeRoss, he doubled down on the idea that family and long-proven friends kept a house standing. The defeats hardened his belief. He had lost ground in court. He would not lose the structure he had built. Health concerns became part of the daily ledger. Age brought familiar problems, circulation issues, blood sugar to monitor, the kind of fatigue that sits in the bones. Transfers routed him through medical units where the routine was slower and the noise different. He adapted. He asked direct questions, absorbed instructions, and adjusted habits. Pride did not keep him from accepting a cane when he needed one. Stamina meant he could still read for hours, still write notes in a compact hand that never wasted a line, still conduct himself with the precise manners that had helped him in courtrooms decades earlier. On the street, the organization kept to the blueprint. Extortion looked less like a shout on a corner and more like a reminder that a permit might stall or a delivery might be delayed. Loan sharking ran on ledgers and code names. Sports betting used runners and avoided flashy wins. Labor influence embedded itself in committees and subcontracts, where a friendly vote or a timely absence could shape who got a job. The state adjusted in parallel, adding forensic accountants and data analysts to squads that once leaned only on bugs and turncoats. Cases filled with bank statements, emails, and spreadsheet tabs that told a story without anyone raising their voice. The contest he had played since his teens had become a chess match with more pieces on the board. He watched the city that framed his origin continue to change. Blocks that had housed social clubs turned into cafes. The old sounds, card games, radio ball games, the clink of espresso cups in back rooms faded into hums of laptops and quiet music. Some older men still met on benches and traded news about who was sick, who was out, who had gone back in. Younger faces passed without knowing what those corners had once hosted. That erasure did not bother him. The past lived where it mattered. In memory, in the network of obligations that linked people across borough lines, in the understanding that a call could still settle a dispute with fewer words than a deposition. He did not need a sign on a door to be relevant. Every few years, lawyers filed motions looking for relief. Some cited shifts in sentencing law that helped other defendants. Some revisited the old controversy around a violent Persico loyalist who had spent years as a secret source, arguing that law enforcement failures infected parts of the record. Judges heard the arguments and wrote careful opinions. The central verdicts, the Enterprise case in Brooklyn and the sweeping commission trial in Manhattan, stood firm. He did not show anger when petitions came back denied. He picked up the pieces available to him: family correspondence, legal reading, and the day-to-day management of an identity that had never been a half measure. If regret surfaced, it lived in private and never reached paper. News of former adversaries filtered in, some released after long bids, others lost to illness. He outlasted many, a fact that reporters framed as proof of stamina and that his critics framed as evidence of the stubborn hold of organized crime on certain parts of civic life. Interviews with former insiders offered a chorus of portraits. One described him as a steady presence who could cool a hot room with a glance. Another called him relentless, a man who would not cede an inch once he had chosen his ground. Both could be true. He had built a reputation on patience and insistence, traits that turned crews into a hierarchy, and a hierarchy into an enterprise that survived repeated waves of arrests. In early 2019, the limits that come for everyone arrived for him. Complications mounted. He was moved under guard to a hospital near the Federal Medical Center where he had been held. Family gathered as rules allowed. Calls went out to old friends who had stood with him at sit-downs when payphones still took coins. There was no drama in those last days, no declarations. He had never loved speeches. He died in March, 85 years old, a man who had been a public figure for most of his life and a prisoner for more than half of it. The Bureau of Prisons noted the death in routine fashion. News outlets ran obituaries that traced the arc from Carroll Gardens to the commission trial to the war with his acting boss and the long years that followed. They used the nickname rivals had given him in the 1,960 seconds, a label that stuck through decades because it captured what people feared: that he could shift, endure, and strike through intermediaries without raising his voice. The funeral was modest by the standards of earlier eras. The era of parades had passed, and law enforcement cameras had a way of turning grief into evidence. Family mourned in private. People who had known him from the beginning sent flowers and kept their distance. Old customs persisted in quiet gestures: a car following at a respectful space, a note slipped to a widow, a contribution made without a name attached. On the street, the question everyone asked had an answer ready before the klute. Services ended. The structure would hold. Andrew Russo, long linked with the Persico camp, was viewed as the senior voice. Other veterans took their places. The blueprint he had insisted on: measured moves, tight circles, and family first remained the default setting. The years after his death confirmed that assessment. A broad indictment in 2021 accused senior figures of using threats and pressure to control a labor union, to steer money from benefit funds, and to keep businesses in line. Names familiar from older papers reappeared near the top of the chart. The case read like a coda to his story. The same focus on labor influence, the same reliance on personal ties that stretched back decades, the same insistence that money move up through envelopes and coded calls. The government's response also echoed the past. Agents recorded conversations, traced financial flows, and presented a pattern rather than a single splashy event. Court papers described the enterprise as an inheritance, an arrangement built and maintained by people who had learned from him and kept learning after he was gone. What remained for those who study his life is a ledger with two columns. On one side sits the discipline that let him hold a family together from behind bars for more than 30 years. He represented himself in one of the defining criminal trials of the 20th century and kept his composure as a judge read a sentence that eclipsed a human lifespan. He wrote letters that balanced affection with order, chose deputies for steadiness over flash, and resisted the urge to turn his name into theater. On the other side sits the damage that structure inflicted. Small businesses that paid out of fear, contractors who felt they had to choose between fairness and survival, union members whose benefits shrank while insiders skimmed, neighborhoods that learned to keep their heads down to avoid being pulled into trouble. The second column never shrinks because the harm lands on people who did not ask to be part of the story. If there is a lesson to carry to bed with you, it is that charisma and calculation can build a machine. But the machine always runs on people, on their worries, on their loyalty, and too often on their fear. He understood that intimately and used it to rise. The state, over time, learned to understand it too, and used law to answer. In that back and forth lived his entire adult life. He was neither myth nor caricature. He was a man shaped by a moment and a city, who chose a path that rewarded his talents and took his freedom, who kept losing in court and kept winning enough on the street to matter to the very end. When his days finally stopped, the hum of the vent was replaced by a different sound, the quiet continuation of a system he had tended, a system that now had to prove it could move without the voice that had guided it for so long. For his family, the end was personal, not historical. A husband gone, a father gone, a grandfather whose stories came from a different world. For the public, the end marked the passing of one of the last men who bridged the mid-century underworld to the modern age, who remembered when a message traveled by hand and lived to see it carried by texts and taps on glass. For law enforcement, the end did not change the work. Cases moved, trials scheduled. The next file opened. The same institutions that had pursued him for decades filed the paperwork and turned to the next name on the list. For anyone listening in the quiet of night, the story asks for a simple kind of attention. Choices compound, power attracts scrutiny, and a calm voice can carry farther than a shout, for better or for worse. He left behind no public memoir, no set of recorded interviews to explain his motives in his own words. The record we have is the one written by courts, by colleagues who became witnesses, by reporters who sorted rumor from proof, and by the day-by-day memory of a city that tracks its own history in sidewalks and storefronts. That record is enough. It tells how a teenager from Brooklyn became a boss, how he shaped a family's earnings through extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and labor racketeering, how he fought the state in courtrooms and lost to statutes designed to see patterns he could not hide, and how he kept his manner even as years stacked up into a number impossible to spend. It ends where every such story ends, in a hospital room far from the streets that gave it shape, with a name that still made people lower their voices even as they understood that time, in the end, is the only force that cannot be negotiated. He left a trail of paperwork and memory that took years to sort. Court transcripts captured his voice in clipped questions, the same rhythm he used in back rooms long before a judge ever said his name out loud. Agents' reports described how money moved through a net of card games, sports ledgers, truck depots, union halls, and contractor offices. Family stories, told softly at kitchen tables, held a different record. Rituals, small kindnesses, the insistence on order even when the world outside felt ready to spin. The strands don't cancel each other. They mesh, and together they draw the outline of a life that touched city politics, labor markets, and daily habits, from Bensonhurst to Bay Ridge, from Carroll Gardens out to Long Island, where contractors moved mixers at dawn. His rise began with the tasks nobody wrote down. A teenager learning which doors to knock on, who to greet first in a crowded room, where to sit so the light favored your eyes and not the other person's. He ran messages, collected small debts, and learned which bookmakers paid on time. That groundwork explained everything that followed. You gain trust by staying calm, keeping track of favors, and remembering which families trade sons as godfathers, because bonds like that hold when stress climbs. He carried that understanding forward when he stepped from crew work into a wider arena. The 1,950 seconds taught him speed and silence. He saw how hijacking required planning, the scouting of routes, the roster of drivers, the whisper about which trailer carried cigarettes, fabrics, or liquor. He learned that a warehouse job meant knowing security schedules, and how to move merchandise into a supply chain that washed tags and hid origins. Those plays were never romantic. They were spreadsheets before spreadsheets existed, lists in heads and notebooks, Profits split by percentages handed down from men who expected reports by the week. Rumors tied him to larger events from that era, including talk that he had been around when a notorious boss was cut down in a midtown barbershop. Historians still argue about who stood where, and no court convicted him of that killing. What stuck was the idea that he moved comfortably among people who made those decisions, that he had the nerve and poise required for high-stakes rooms. You can feel that impression at a distance even now, when reporters flip through old clips and see his name appear near other names that shaped the city's underworld map. By the turn of the 1,960 seconds, he had stepped into the Profaci world with confidence. He collected tributes from bookmakers, took a cut from card games, and helped manage Shylock books whose interest rates doubled as pressure valves. The Abbottmarco episode rippled through those years, pushing the Gallo crew toward defiance and setting the stage for kidnappings that shook the family's routine. When he switched allegiance to the side that backed the old guard, he earned the nickname that followed him for life. He knew how to pivot when survival demanded it, and he would not apologize for a choice that protected his position. That cold logic, prized in his circles, read as betrayal to others. Both views traveled with him. The attempted strangling of Larry Gallo inside a Brooklyn bar became a touchstone. Police interrupted the scene, arrests followed, and witnesses remembered a cord pulled tight in a dark room. He wasn't convicted for that act, yet the image fixed in public imagination. A compact man appearing at dangerous moments, then disappearing as cases weakened, or witnesses grew vague. It wasn't magic. It was method use of intermediaries, carefully selected meeting places, an instinct for exits and timing. When Joseph Profaci died, and the family eventually took the Colombo name, the young strategist expanded his reach. He helped coordinate routes for stolen goods, guided bookmaking profits to safe hands, and placed reliable men in spots where labor decisions could be nudged. He understood that the most durable money came from routine weekly envelopes, predictable percentages, the steady hum of numbers games, not from one-time splashes that soaked the page with risk. In time, he placed trusted allies near locals on the waterfront and in concrete, areas where a vote or a slowdown could turn contracts. The 1,971 shooting of Joseph Colombo on a Manhattan street forced another reshuffle. He stepped forward as a key decision-maker, even while dealing with charges tied to theft and extortion. Jury rooms became part of his landscape. He listened, took notes, and prepared appeals, then returned to business through proxies when he could. Evidence in those cases often traced patterns rather than single acts. A crew collecting interest at rates that guaranteed a debtor never truly escaped. A contractor paying to avoid sabotage. A union official taking a side deal instead of serving members. He was not unique in that approach. He was consistent. Labor became a centerpiece. A Colombo-linked official rose in a concrete workers, local and later stood accused, then convicted, of steering contracts through bribes and threats. That office sat where money met cement, where a city's skeleton is poured and set, coordinating which firms won bids, how much they charged, and which union crews appeared let the people above skim with quiet hands. The concrete club, described in the commission case, didn't need gunfire to function. It needed meetings, envelopes, and a shared understanding among leaders that disputes could be settled at a table rather than in a street scene that would bring cameras. His decision to represent himself during the commission trial startled court watchers but fit his story. He had spent a life reading rooms, listening for tells, and spotting weak points. In court, he used the same instincts with formal rules. He questioned witnesses, pushed at dates that didn't align, and argued that association did not equal agreement. Prosecutors countered with tapes, charts, and insiders who explained how the bosses coordinated large pours and assigned contractors to million-dollar jobs. The jury sided with the government, and the judge's sentence, stacked on top of an earlier racketeering term, erased any practical chance at freedom. He accepted the result with the same posture he had worn since he first stood before a bench. Steady, contained, attentive. From federal units, he imposed order through appointments. Acting bosses on the street balanced diplomacy and discipline. He chose men who could collect quietly and keep egos in check. The arena challenge in the early 1,990 seconds tested that model. He refused to treat a delegated chair as permanent property, and a bitter split followed. The fallout filled case files, and Arena's conviction later sealed that revolt's fate. The cost for the family was high arrests, defections, businesses frightened by public violence. He took the longer view. Better to bear that pain than surrender control. Late in that decade, a charismatic Brooklyn figure vanished after a midday meeting. Years later, trials framed the incident as a decisive strike ordered by leaders aligned with his camp. Juries convicted his son and a close aide, and a judge imposed life terms. Those outcomes confirmed what many already believed, that the Persico line would remove obstacles rather than share the crown. Glare from that case never faded. It sharpened the government's willingness to present the family as a dynasty tied to an approach that valued dominance over negotiation. As the century turned, enforcement tactics shifted. Bugs never went away, but financial analysis stepped into a starring role. The paper side of racketeering percents skimmed from bids, consulting fees that masked coercion, benefit funds, siphoned by insiders, moved to the center of indictments. His people adapted, but adaptation takes practice, and courts recorded mistakes. Cases in the 2000s and 2010 seconds named cousins, nephews, and loyal captains. Pleas stacked up. A few fought and lost. The pattern still pointed back to him, even as age and illness narrowed his world to a room, a yard, and the echo of a steel door. He never wrote a manifesto. He left hints in routines. Promote people with deep ties. Avoid spectacle. Let others take credit for loud wins, if it keeps heat away. Lean on blood when decisions cut close. Reinforce belonging with small gestures, help with a lawyer, a holiday envelope for a family waiting at home, a call returned when it matters. At the same time, keep a hard line on disobedience. In his view, that mix prevented chaos. Judges read it differently, a method for keeping extortion and fraud in place while insulating the man who profited from them. The damage caused by that system is easiest to see in the quiet stories. Restaurant owners who kept 2 sets of books to hide payments. Contractors who looked the other way when bids felt tilted but survival demanded a signature. Union members who learned their benefits weren't secure because someone else wanted a slush fund. People didn't use dramatic words for those losses. They used tired ones. Late rent, delayed surgery, a job that never called back. Those outcomes rarely make front pages, but they form the ground truth that justifies long sentences and aggressive statutes. His death closed a personal chapter and opened a public sift through legacy. Writers called him one of the last links to the mid-century order, a boss who straddled eras by steering a family through tape recorders, computer files, and social media noise from inside a cell. Agents saw the same endurance and translated it into policy lessons. Long cases aimed high, pressure on unions and construction, and investment in teams that mix detectives, accountants, and lawyers who know RICO inside out. The family he led tried to prove it could function without his voice. Arrests in 2021 said the old playbook still had believers. The names had changed. The methods looked familiar. The law answered in kind. In the end, his record reads as a study in contrasts. He could be courteous in ways that surprised guards and lawyers. He kept track of who needed help and delivered it without announcement. He also presided over a system that charged tolls to people trying to work, that punished refusal, and that bent public projects to private ends. He built a durable hierarchy and lost a lifetime to it. He made choices early that set a course no one could unwind. He owned those choices. He never cooperated. He never asked for a softer label. What remains is caution, not celebration. A teenager's hunger for respect can harden into a man's belief that control equals safety. That belief, repeated across a network, becomes an enterprise that spreads costs to people who never agreed to pay. The state exists, in part, to answer that, and over his decades on the stage it learned how. If the city he shaped now looks cleaner on the surface, it's because cycles like his taught hard lessons about what hides under ordinary traffic. His story invites you to rest with that truth and consider where small decisions lead when the first yes feels harmless and the second one binds. Night settled over the city he once paced, and the record of his life lay scattered across archives and memories. The official documents spelled out dates, charges, and sentences. Family recollections carried the private moments that rarely reached print. A father who wrote on birthdays, a husband who asked about school, a relative who sent help when someone needed a lawyer. The two sets of pages never joined neatly, but together they formed the outline of a man who shaped a criminal enterprise for more than half a century and outlasted many who tried to unseat him. What held steady across versions was a portrait of composure. Whether seated at a kitchen table or a defense table in federal court, he kept the same steady posture, eyes forward, notes in order, voice even. The earliest lessons never left him. As a boy on South Brooklyn corners, he learned that information moves through respect, that a favor remembered is worth more than a loud promise, and that choosing the right moment to speak matters more than talking often. Those habits were useful when he entered the Profaci world and moved among figures who ran betting schemes and loan books. With iron discipline, he navigated the 1,950 seconds with a knack for planning thefts from trucks and storerooms, keeping crews on schedule and goods moving before the sun rose. Rumors attached his name to high-profile violence during those years, including the killing of a notorious boss in a Manhattan barbershop. Historians still debate precise roles. The courts never pinned that act on him. Yet the stories served a purpose inside his world, signaling that he belonged in rooms where major choices were made. When the Profaci family fractured, he made a choice that would brand him for life. The break with the Gallo faction pushed the city into a tense cycle of kidnappings and reprisals. He sided with the established leadership and carried out assignments that reinforced old rules. Police reports from that era linked him to an attempted strangling of Larry Gallo in a Brooklyn bar, a moment that hardened his reputation. Charges connected to that incident failed to deliver a lasting conviction, but the episode followed him. It taught the public a simple story, and simple stories stick. A quiet man who surfaced at dangerous times and slipped away when the lights came on. He was not the only figure who operated like that in those years. He was one of the few who built a career on repeating the pattern while avoiding the splash that brings a legal avalanche. After Joseph Profaci's death, reshuffling put Joseph Colombo in place, and the family took a new name. He rose with the change. His value came from organizing revenue streams others treated as scattered opportunities. Numbers games, card rooms, loans at hard interest, quiet pressure on labor locals, union contacts on the docks, all of it fit into a grid, if someone kept count and set rules. He favored regular income over stunts. The frame became clearer as the 1,970 seconds arrived. Envelopes moved on time. Brokers knew where to send cash. Contractors understood that a peaceful job site had a price. The trade-off was brutal for people on the other end of the transaction. Their choices narrowed to paying or risking trouble. Prosecutors later translated those private arrangements into public charges: extortion, loan sharking, wire fraud, labor racketeering, and conspiracies that bound the acts together. He spent parts of the late 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds under indictment or in custody, accused of hijacking and other rackets. Each return to the street was followed by an adjustment in structure. He placed reliable men in charge, rotated acting leaders, and deepened ties to relatives whose loyalty felt unbreakable. The shooting of Joseph Colombo in 1971 left a vacuum that he helped fill. Over time, law enforcement came to describe him as the boss, even when court dates or sentences kept him away from the boroughs that built his name. That dual existence leader at a distance would define the rest of his life. The 1,980 seconds brought the climactic legal battles. He was already facing a Brooklyn racketeering case when the Manhattan U.S. Attorney's Office unveiled a strategy aimed at the heads of New York's families. Prosecutors argued that the commission, the informal council where bosses settled disputes and coordinated major enterprises, functioned as a governing board. If it set policy across families and controlled industries, then the members could be charged together. He met that theory head-on, representing himself in both Brooklyn and Manhattan. In one courtroom, he cross-examined former insiders who described intimidation and debt collection. In the other, he challenged tapes that captured leaders discussing the Concrete Club, a system for steering large pours and public projects to favored firms. Juries convicted. Judges imposed extraordinary terms. 39 years in Brooklyn, then 100 more in Manhattan, stacked to ensure he would never leave custody. Appeals failed. The numbers fixed his fate. Even those sentences did not end his influence. He managed through letters, legal visits, and brief calls, naming acting leaders, who kept collections flowing and tempers under control. He leaned on family. His cousin Andrew Russo took senior roles at different times. His son Alphonse assumed a central position when free, supported by trusted figures like John DeRoss. The message was consistent: avoid showy moves, keep disputes quiet, and maintain the rhythm that paid legal bills and supported families. That steady hand helped the family weather a challenge in the early 1990 seconds when Victor Arena, the acting boss, refused to step aside. The conflict that followed spilled onto streets and into headlines. Arrests and convictions ended Arena's bid, but the cost was high: lives upended, businesses shaken, fresh waves of surveillance, and a permanent stain on the family's public picture. Later that decade, another test arrived when William Cutolo, a charismatic earner with a wide following, vanished after a meeting. Years afterward, a federal case framed the disappearance as a decisive move ordered by leaders tied to the Persico faction, meant to settle succession and keep the hierarchy intact. Juries convicted Alphonse Persico and Jackie DeRoss. Life sentences followed. The prosecution of that episode, built on cooperating testimony and supporting evidence, cemented a narrative that had formed across decades. The Persico line protected its position with unwavering force, even from a distance. Defense counsel argued otherwise. The verdict stood. Through the 2000s and 2010 seconds, the family's revenue model evolved but did not change at its core. Sports betting, loan sharking, and protection schemes remained staples. Labor influence adjusted to a modern economy, moving from blunt threats to procedural pressure applied through subcontracts, scheduling, and union committees. Fraud flowed into newer channels like healthcare billing or telemarketing when opportunities appeared. Investigators adapted in parallel, pairing undercover work with forensic accounting and digital evidence. Indictments read like organizational charts, with bank records attached. Recurring names, Russo, DeRoss, younger relatives, showed that blood and long friendships still shaped promotions. Pleas outnumbered trials. Judges wrote about deterrence and the public cost of schemes that turned fear into profit, then set long terms to match those assessments. Inside, he aged with quiet resolve. Guards described a patient man who followed routines, asked thoughtful questions at medical appointments, and kept his area tidy. Visitors saw the same steadiness they had seen in the 1970 seconds. Careful listening, short sentences, no wasted motion. He tracked wins and losses for his people, remembered who stayed loyal, and never considered cooperation. Health complications grew more serious as he entered his mid-80s. He died in 2019 at a hospital near the Federal Medical Center where he was housed, ending a custody stretch that spanned more than 3 decades. Obituaries placed him among the last leaders who bridged the mid-century underworld and the data-driven enforcement era, a man who ran a family from behind barriers and kept his title until the end. The years after his death showed how thoroughly his methods had shaped the family. In 2021, a broad case alleged that senior figures used pressure to control a laborer's local, skim benefit funds, and enforce compliance among contractors. The approach sounded familiar: soft threats wrapped in procedural language, payments disguised as consulting, decisions steered by quiet votes. The government's case also followed a trail he knew well: taped calls, cooperating witnesses, bank statements, and patterns that, when placed together, painted an enterprise rather than a single act. The names had changed. The music remained the same. That continuity is part of his legacy, for better or worse. Looking back across the full arc, a few constants stand out. He believed that calm beats noise, that narrow circles outlast crowds, and that family bonds hold when pressure rises. Those beliefs helped him survive early battles, climb to the top, and keep control from cells that changed zip codes but not his influence. They also anchored a system that extracted money through intimidation and rigged choices. Businesses paid to avoid trouble. Workers lost benefits. Markets bent away from fairness. Ordinary lives bore the strain. Courts sorted that ledger and answered with statutes built for patterns, conspiracy, and RICO, because they matched the way the RICO enterprise operated. His story is a reminder that talent is neutral. The same traits that make a person a capable organizer can sustain harm when put to corrosive ends. He managed details, held people together, and prepared with discipline. Applied to lawful work, Those habits build firms and institutions. In his world, they maintained a racketeering structure that pulled in steady income by narrowing the options of others. He knew the cost. He accepted it. In the code he followed, loyalty to the structure outweighed everything else, including his freedom. That choice made him a figure of endurance, and, at the same time, a cautionary symbol for a city that struggled for decades to loosen the hold of private power on public life. Neighborhoods he knew by heart tell the tale without speeches. The old clubs are gone, or turned into shops with bright windows. Unions operate under more scrutiny. Contractors keep deeper files and call lawyers before they sign. Police work with analysts who can map flows of money as readily as they can shadow a car. Still, the human draw to quick influence persists. Younger versions of the men he once mentored step into the same mistakes because the early returns feel good and the long-term bill seems far away. If his life offers a bedtime lesson, it is that the bill always arrives. It might come as a knock at dawn, a judge's sentence, or a steady drain on a neighborhood that can't quite explain why things cost more than they should. However it appears, it is relentless. In quiet moments near the end, he did not pretend otherwise. He kept writing, kept reading, kept the ledger of favors in his head. He had chosen his path in a city that rewarded nerve and punished hesitation. That choice had given him decades of sway and taken the simple pleasures of ordinary freedom. The children and grandchildren who visited saw both truths at once. They saw a man who remembered birthdays and asked about school. They also saw the weight of sentences measured in calendar pages thicker than most people ever turn. Those two images do not cancel. They coexist. That is how real lives look when you stop trying to make them neat. The last word belongs to the city he moved through. It learned from men like him. It built cases that reached higher and pushed deeper into industries where private deals once decided public outcomes. The law grew sharper because the schemes grew more intricate. The people who paid for those schemes, often without ever meeting him, pushed for change in quiet ways by reporting a threat, by refusing to sign, by voting out officials who turned a blind eye. Progress rarely arrives with a flourish. It comes in increments, like the slow turn of a safe dial that opens a door a fraction at a time. His presence on the stage, long and forceful, hastened that learning. For that, the public can be grateful even as it mourns the cost paid along the way. Close your eyes and picture the boy on a summer sidewalk, a hand-me-down shirt, a city buzzing at the corners. Picture the man decades later, gray at the temple, pencil in hand, counting breaths in a room without a key. Between those images lies a life of sharp decisions and steady posture, of rules followed inside a code that prized silence over mercy. He became the boss who would not bend, the defendant who asked his own questions, the prisoner who kept his schedule while the seasons cycled outside. He left behind a structure that still knows his name, and a caution written in plain language for anyone tempted by the same path. Power without accountability eventually answers to someone. In New York, over time, it answered to the law. And that was the story of Carmine Persico the Snake, a man who held power longer than most, ruling the Colombo crime family from prison with a grip that never loosened. His life was one of strategy, betrayal, and survival, a legacy that still lingers in whispers of the underworld. Thank you for joining me tonight here at the Silent Empires. Don't forget to share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach across the world. And if you haven't yet, subscribe so you never miss another tale of gangsters and the empires they left behind. Rest now, drift into silence, and good night.